Okay, welcome to PodRocket. I'm Kate, the producer of PodRocket. With me hosting today is Noel. Hello, Noel. How are you doing?
Good. How are you, Kate?
Thanks for joining us as the host today. And then our guests are Alex Page and Yuraima Estevez from the Polaris design team. Hello, Alex and Yuraima.
Hello.
Thank you for having us. Excited to be here.
Awesome. Yeah. So I think to jump in with, maybe we should kind of like frame what Polaris is and what its role is with Shopify, particularly for those listeners who like aren't familiar with the Shopify ecosystem and like the purpose it serves. So can you kind of like set that up a little bit? Like, what's the mission of the design system? Why is it needed? Who's it for? Kind of lay that out.
Yeah, I mean, I might start and I'll hand over to Yuraima at some point, but Polaris has been at Shopify since way before I even joined. Like, I've been at Shopify for 3 years now. It is a design system. Obviously, there's lots of layers to what is a design system. So when we talk about a design system at Shopify, we're talking about the website, which contains guidance. So lots of guidance around how to write content, how to design patterns, how to create different flows in the UI, what we think of when we think of building different experiences. I think of our components and our code that comes with them. So what makes them accessible, performant, scalable, how they allow people to build up different patterns and solve different problems. So there's lots of like interconnecting pieces, but the reason for all of this existing is we need a way that to enable our designers and developers to solve complex problems at scale. And that's the real point of this. So like, why do we have this guidance and why do we have these components and why do we have this website and these repositories? It's because we want to solve really complex design problems at scale, and code and tooling and guidance is the ways that we believe that we can do that. Yuraima, do you want to maybe talk a bit to our mission and like what we're aiming for?
Yeah, totally. So our mission for this year is, I would say, pretty ambitious, but I believe we can definitely hit it for 2022. As Alex said, the design system itself is for the Shopify admin. So the admin is like the bread and butter of Shopify. It's where all of our merchants can manage their orders, their products, their customers. And we're building the tools that enable designers and developers to build the best products for our merchants at Shopify. And our mission this year is to make sure that 90% of the admin, 90% of our bread and butter, as I said, is using Polaris. And the reason we want to do that is so that everything we build in the admin is always getting the best components, the best performance, best accessibility, and is consistent across any product, any team that is working in the admin, any experience that the merchant is in, page, section, whatever. So really just making sure that we have a consistent experience across all of the admin, and hitting that high bar of 90% so that at any point, if we need to make any changes to the Polaris design system, we can more or less click a button or, release a new update and say, okay, the majority of the admin now gets to benefit from all of the amazing changes we've made.
Gotcha. So how are you kind of working towards that goal of adoption? Like, what does that look like?
So I think we started this new goal, I'm going to say in earnest this year, but it's something that we've been talking about for many months. This year we kicked off, or actually at the end of last year, we kicked off a new project to really think about what is Polaris design system at the foundational level, and how is it serving our users, our designers and developers, and how is it falling short? So taking a really hard look in the mirror and basically saying, like, where can we do a lot better? And the thing that was most obvious was our design system is a little too rigid. It was built with a specific purpose. And, as Shopify, the admin, the number of people working in the admin grew, so did the complexity of the admin and, in turn, the complexity of the design system. And now it's gotten to a point where it's too rigid. It is a little bit too flexible. And we're taking a step back, essentially, and deciding to go back to the foundations, go back to the base layer of Polaris design system and say, where do we make the most significant changes that are going to provide the most value? A lot of it is like taking a look at our primitives, our like really baseline components, and saying, can we break this down further? Can we make this more flexible, more atomic, so that our users can come in and just like pick all the things out that they need for what they're building and use it in whatever way they need. Alex, please feel free to jump in if I missed anything.
I think that's good. It's like it's really tricky when we talk about adoption because it comes back to like what our users need, and our users need so many different things from a design system team. It could be, how do I frame this sentence? It could be, how do I build this little piece of the UI? So we have like an unlimited number of problems. So what we've been doing recently is just trying to go and ask why, like to Yuraima's point of like getting down to like some of the root cause problems. Like if we ask why enough times, why is this component so large and so different and so custom, and why can't we put this into the design system? We'll usually end up with an answer which is like, there isn't enough flexibility in layout at this point in the UI, and we wish that we could create this thing in a way that was more scalable. And then we want to solve that problem. And so when we're going through and supporting and helping these teams adopt the system, it's really trying to find those like deep underlying problems at the heart of the system, instead of just being like, okay, cool, let's bring all your problems into the system, and then we've got more problems in the system, but we've got higher adoption. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. I guess maybe to help us frame a little bit more, and you guys are talking about like working with teams. Is that mainly internal teams, or are you guys working with like external design teams and devs as well?
That's a really good question. We have multiple users. So the primary user that we do focus on are the internal teams building the admin product at Shopify. So the admin product is like, when I am a merchant running a store, I log into shopify.com/admin, and I'll see a list of all of the orders that have come in that have been bought from my store. I can see a list of my users. I can see a list of my products. I can go to like a details page of lots of form elements and edit those things. So realistically, like these people building these UIs, these lists and these forms and these flows, this is our primary audience. But the Polaris design system does also have a really strong mandate to help also our third party and our developer ecosystem. So there are a lot of people externally that contribute to building on Shopify's platform. They'll either be building applications, or they will be building integrations with how Shopify works. And sometimes they want their UI to feel a part of the application or a part of the system. They want it to feel like it's a first party experience. So we try to build tools and experiences to make their life easier as well. We don't want people to want to build or have an excellent idea about like gift cards and then have to build everything from scratch. We want them to like get some really good primitives, accessible, some examples that they can like configure together to solve that problem. Yuraima, is there anything you would add around our audience? I mean, it is an open source repo too. You could maybe talk a little about that.
Yeah, so as Alex said, we have our third-party developers that are external to Shopify, but still working within the Shopify ecosystem and building out really amazing tools for our merchants. So in order to give them that like really solid base and starting point, we have the Polaris design system, open source, available. It's actually how I learned about Shopify, was in the design system space. Polaris is one of the more well-known design systems. And I knew about Polaris far before I knew Shopify, and then realized like, oh, wow, this is a really good starting point for building out any sort of tools that are meant to be living inside of this Shopify admin ecosystem. So we do have that third-party audience, and then the internal audience, we mentioned already, the designers and developers at Shopify working the admin. A lot of times we will partner with them to help maybe support when they are coming up with new ideas, or if they're struggling a little bit with any new products. Sometimes they will come to us and say, hey, we have this idea for contributing this back to the Polaris design system. Can you give us a little bit of support? Or sometimes folks will be like, hey, we have this product that we need to build. We're not quite sure the right way to go about it. We know that the design system has some guidelines, but our use case is maybe a little bit more nuanced or bespoke, and we want to go about it the right way. So it really depends, the team, the individual contributor, but it is this kind of two-sided audience of internal users, designers and developers, and then third-party developers who are external to Shopify, who are also building in this ecosystem.
Nice. That's interesting. Yeah. So Yuraima, you said you were familiar with the design system before you even knew it was tied to Shopify at all. Is that right?
I knew about it and knew about Shopify as it's a company. I had no idea what Shopify did. I had no idea it was e-commerce until I looked at Shopify. I was like, this is awesome, and dug a little bit deeper and was like, oh, okay, so this is specifically for the product that they have built, the e-commerce platform that they have. So it was great because it's an amazing design system in and of itself, but it is also built with a specific purpose of working within the Shopify ecosystem, specifically for the admin, specifically for the designers, developers that are working in that space.
Gotcha. That kind of leads to my next question then of is there any use case outside of the Shopify ecosystem, or are the components pretty closely tied to Shopify, APIs and data fetching and stuff like that?
I mean, there's no API connections. Actually, sometimes frustratingly, we'll have a really big component like a resource list, and it will give you very light guidance on how to set that up. But when you want to set up sorting and filtering and populating the data in those lists, that's a lot of work for you and your team. And I wish we had better examples of that, but that flexibility means that you can use it for lots of different things. I think where the sort of more strictness would live would be on the design side. So if we looked at our page component, which is a very opinionated component on almost how a form page should be structured at Shopify, that is very strict, sort of layout and typography and positioning of buttons and things like this. And if you were going to use that page component to create a blog, I'm sure you get really frustrated really quickly with the layouts and the opinions there. But if you went back to the smaller layers, like the typography layers, and started to construct your own layout, maybe you could have some success, but you'd probably still be like, this doesn't feel as flexible as something like Tailwind. And it's not meant to be as flexible as Tailwind or as Bootstrap. It is meant to be opinionated to the products that we're building at Shopify.
Gotcha. Very cool. That makes sense. Yeah, I mean, maybe then kind of the next question from there is we talked about some higher level kind of layout components and lower level stuff. There's buttons and drop downs and stuff. But maybe a good question to answer is how does a design system differ from something like a component library?
Oof. I mean, it's a really good question. The reason why I made that sound is I think at times Polaris feels like a component library. And the reason that I say that is a system to me should be really easy to change and to configure and to push out a change, and you sort of see that flow through the whole system. But due to our lack of coverage and due to the way that things have been architected, it makes it really difficult at times to make changes like that. So when I think of a design system, I'm thinking of a really low layer API of tokens, and design tokens are sort of the smallest piece that you can have, a blue color for links or a rounded circle for avatars, and keeping that rounded circle value and then reusing that somewhere else with an icon component. That becomes a really powerful system. And then if you wanted to update that, maybe you wanted to change the font family from a system font to a branded font, you do that in one location instead of over 30 components. So when I think of a component library, I don't see that connection to a lower level system. It's more just here's the text, here's the page, here's the button. But if you wanted to make a change to the typography in all of those three places, you'd make it in those three places. Whereas the system is sort of providing the integral links. I think the other thing that I'd talk about is like the people and the culture and like the things that we're trying to impact, and they feel quite different. But maybe Yuraima, you can speak to that. I feel like you know where I'm going.
Yeah, totally. I totally felt that noise that you made, Alex, because I feel like that is a question that I have tried to answer many times and had been asked many times. And everything that you said about like the system layer is completely true, but there's also this other aspect of like the culture around a design system and the culture around like what you're trying to accomplish with the design system. Um, there's the aspect obviously of like consistency and high quality UX, getting a lot of the free things out of the box like accessibility, performance, secure components, things like that. But without the other parts of that, it is really just like either a style guide, which is telling you how should something look, or a component library, which is basically just like building blocks that you can configure in any way. But without the two things meeting in the middle, which is where like the people come in and making sure that you're speaking the same language across designers and developers, making sure that you have documented decisions about why you build something this certain way or design something a certain way, or how you are recommending someone use or build a page or something like that. It all kind of just falls into the ether and anyone can do anything. And then it is not as powerful or robust as it could be. So it is a design system is what it provides to you. It provides the like, how should this look? How does this work? Here are the pieces. But it's also the why behind it. Like, why is this the way it is? Why should I build this in this specific way? Why did I choose these colors, this typography, this spacing? And I think a lot of that is where the power of the design system really comes together and you get the value of it.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. I think in my head, like a design system is like a higher level, like you guys, there's like a human element to it, and like there's designers and like opinions and ways in which this thing should feel to interact with. But it's interesting to hear your guys' kind of take on like the community around it being so integral to making something feel like a design system versus just like a component library that is maybe implementing a design system. Yeah, but very cool. I guess kind of on that note, then can we get into like Polaris and its opinions and why it is the way that it is a little bit, like the visual style, the performance, like that kind of thing. Maybe starting with like the visual element is a good place to begin.
Yeah, I mean, might be a slightly hot take, or I mean, people on our team probably wouldn't say that, but I think the visual style at times can feel a bit dated. And the reason for, I mean, like I will talk to the visual style though. Like we have lots of cards, like everywhere you'll see in our design and in our products, are big white rectangles, lots of grays, not a lot of color. We've really tried to like make the visual style feel like a powerful tool to like help you complete tasks, but there's a lot of white space and there's a lot of like similar repeated patterns, and at times it doesn't feel like that powerful tool. So back to your question, though, I try to put a positive spin on it. There are some like really great like design opinions in like our illustration style, for instance, which is like very flat and creative, and so like these beautiful aesthetics of like people and masking shapes and things like this. But when you look at our design, sort of like typography and shapes and things like this, it's a lot more rigid. It's like, we're here to help you get things done. We don't want to really intrude or get in your way. It's like a powerful tool to help you get from A to B. And at times that, I don't know, that could be more creative or could be more, like it could be more, diversity of design opinion in there as well. And I think that's something that we notice is like, if somebody uses cards in like some of the prominent areas of the website, then another person will be like, oh, that's the pattern that we should use in our area of the website. So that also sort of scales some of those things where we're like, we wish you were more creative, or we wish that you tried and experimented more with the design. So yeah, there's a few layers there, but like, yeah, we want to keep it a fresh visual style. And to make it a fresh visual style, we have to have lots of adoption. So we're really focusing on adoption right now so that we can push out more improvements to our visual start across the system, across the product. Yuraima, would there be anything you want to add?
Honestly, I think you put that really well, Alex. So I'll leave it at that.
I'm curious, you have a lot of, there's so much, so there's a lot of documentation, the system's very big, but you mentioned it kind of can feel old. I guess I'm curious, is there this thought that, you probably see a lot of design that's comes out every day. It's like, oh, this is so cool and awesome. How do you keep something updated and also thoroughly documented and the size that Polaris is?
I mean, I don't know if you can, honestly. I think that's the goal for us, honestly, as a company right now. Is I think that we focus too much on scaling the system and not enough on improving the visual design. And I think it got to a point where the visual design hadn't been improved, but then the scale started to lack. So I feel at times you have to focus on one and drop the ball on the other, or focus on the other and drop the ball on the other one. And right now it feels like we're really focusing on the scaling aspect. Our team is really focusing on getting more adoption so that we can push the design forwards. But when we get into that pushing the designs forwards stages, we hope that the scale behind it is going to continue and keep its momentum. But sometimes that that can drop too. And it kind of gets into a bit of the breaking changes and the how you version and how you ship large design changes as well, because that's not necessarily easy at a company of our scale. I think I read the other day that in the past 120 days, there was over 1 million lines of TypeScript shipped to our admin products. And that's a lot. That's a lot of code. And to be a design system that is supporting that speed and that momentum is really challenging. And we need to have things built on the right layers so that as those 1 million lines of code get created, hopefully 800 to 900,000 of those lines of code are coming from components in Polaris. And that's not always the case, but that's the goal. So I hope that makes sense, but it's a difficult question to answer.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense.
Yeah, is there a performance element at all to the decisions you guys are making, kind of keeping things simple? I guess do components generally map to the HTML native types or the primitives there?
We definitely have a bunch, a really good baseline that are probably analogous with most. I'm going to say most or a lot of the out of the box HTML elements that exist. But we also think about accessibility. So we think about how what are the UI patterns or UI components that are really prevalent in the admin, and how can we construct them and put them together so that they are fully accessible and performant. And they may not be the exact copy paste from an HTML element, but they are constructed in a way that they will hopefully work for the most people, and be fast and be secure and do the job the way that we need it to do the job.
Yeah, performance is tricky. I feel Johan, one of our staff designers on our team, he would even talk about the human aspect of performance and what does it feel like and what does it mean to feel like this thing is a performant product. And I think that almost comes back to UI patterns too. When I open this page, what do I see? How does it transition to a complete state? What is changing? Are things jumping up and moving everywhere, or are they staying in one place and the important information is available to me immediately and the less important information populates at a later time? So there's also that aspect, which is very difficult to systemize, but we do have patterns in our system to help with that. But then I just also wanted to add to what Yuraima was saying. There's also the lowest layer where we'll look at a line of CSS and we'll be is this will change property positively impacting the code, or is it negatively impacting the code? And maybe this will change property is in a button component, which is rendered 30 times on the page or something like this. And we're realizing that is calling that will change too many times and we need to like remove it. So there are lots of layers that we look into on performance, but I think to Yuraima's point, we really focus on that, like helping users performantly flow through tasks and building the right patterns that are accessible and help them complete the problems that they put in front of them.
That's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't considered like a design system or even a component library's role in like trying to reduce things like content jumping around on the page and like jitter and stuff like that. How are those problems solvable at the design system level?
I think it's around education and also around best practices. So, for instance, we don't have anything now, but we have an experiences section on our website, and we might actually create a page there called loading. And we might talk about how to create the best loading experience. It might not necessarily have code. It might not necessarily go into depth around what is cumulative layout shift. I can't really say that word, sorry.
Say it 3 times.
Yeah. Like we might not go into those deep like technical sort of sides, but we definitely will talk about the impact of like things moving for a user or what it means to make a page that feels performant and feels fast. Like a page that loads in a second from start to finish might actually feel really quick to a user if certain things populate quicker or certain things flow in. So we want to like educate and inspire and also help the product designers at Shopify and the external people that use the product as well.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. How about like you guys have mentioned accessibility a couple of times? What role does that play in your decision making? You know, like you're picking and thinking of things like colors and animations and stuff like that. Like how do those two like kind of play into that accessibility angle?
Yeah, I'd actually say that accessibility is one of those core principles that we have on the team and certainly at the design system level. Almost everything, I want to say everything, but that feels very definitive. Almost everything that we build, we want to make sure that this is going to reach and work for the most people. So we do a lot of keyboard navigation testing. I know that a lot of the developers are testing things with screen readers and making sure how is this going to sound to someone who may not be able to see the screen or who isn't able to use a mouse or any other sort of ranges of abilities or disabilities. And that does definitely come into play for like color and how things scale, and even for things like what Alex was just talking about, how a page loads and making sure that things don't jump around on the page. Like that in and of itself is accessibility. It's of course something that speaks to performance and seeing like what does the user feel when it comes to how fast this is, but it's also like, will a user who is maybe motion sensitive, are they going to be triggered or get sick because a lot of elements on the page are moving around a bunch? So we do definitely think about it at many layers, and it's something that we keep pretty high on the list of priorities.
Yeah, nice. That's interesting. I guess I'm thinking of my experience like writing React components, and I feel like a lot of the time the safety net that's helping me ensure that like I'm writing HTML that is, you know, at least reasonably accessible and like works for as many people as possible is like linter rules will be like, you know, ensure there's always like these certain tags on these elements so they're like navigable by a screen reader, or you know, like certain handlers shouldn't be put on this element because there's no way for someone like not using a mouse to interact that way. Does the design system have those opinions, or like how is that enforced?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Like one that comes to mind is like a text input component in Polaris today has a label property, and the label property I'm pretty sure is required. So it's like we always expect there to be a label with a text input. Then you can also, but the problem is then we also add a property to hide the label, and it sort of keeps scaling from there. And one of the things that I think I'd like to see with our system is a little bit more trust, and it's difficult because accessibility isn't something we want to compromise on. But we really want to give trust back to the designers and developers building these things. So one example of this might be we have text inputs that don't have labels, and that's okay. But we trust that these teams will add the label and do it correctly. Or maybe we will, to your point, add some linting rules to like double check that like if there isn't a label prop, that there is still a label connected to that React element. So there's lots of approaches, and I think our current approach does feel very leaning in the side of we want to like enforce and ensure accessibility. But at times, like we might have a really complex, almost like table with like text inputs in it to like modify like each row of the table, and that becomes really difficult to, I'd say, scale or make accessible when that flexibility isn't there. So there's a lot of combinations like that we're constantly thinking about in terms of what is the right opinion to have at the system level to make this accessible, and like how much trust and education do we potentially have to like remove restrictions, if that makes sense. And that's a difficult balance to achieve.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's kind of like why I've found like the linting rules are kind of an elegant solution, right? Because like, oh, you, like warn me, tell me, I can like go add and ignore if I know it's this fine in this case. But like, oh, it's a handy reminder.
Yeah,
I guess kind of on that front, there. Correct me if I'm wrong, but there's like a way you can kind of get a lot of the styling and stuff of the design system just with CSS includes. Is that right?
Yeah, I'll talk to that quickly. Like we take a lot of the Sass files from Polaris and we'll run that through like a build process, and we can output CSS. This isn't pretty or very well documented, but what it does mean is that teams that are just building like Scrappy or Hacky and just want to like use some of those CSS classes, they can do that. I think we want to refine or make this approach a lot better though, because right now it just doesn't really feel like a really well constructed or really robust solution. It's more just like hey, we can make our system more tech agnostic by like running some Sass through a build process and outputting the stuff so that people can use it.
Gotcha. Is there not a lot of like components or elements that are losing like structural data when you try to do that makes that difficult? I'm thinking, you know, like a card. I think you said there's like a lot of card-esque elements. Like are those not really portrayed in the CSS at all? Like you kind of got to be using the React components to get those card layouts.
No, you can definitely like get like a .polaris-card class out from the outputted Sass, but there isn't really any documentation or like explanation that like, oh, you need a div with this thing, and then inside it you probably should add a title with this thing. So it's more around like you get this big blob of CSS, and we really hope that you understand how the HTML is structured. And I think that could definitely be iterated on or be made a much better experience. But Yuraima, do you want to maybe talk about like, I don't know, like tech agnostic, why that's important, or like what that means for our third party developers? Because obviously React is great, but it has some limitations for them.
Yeah, totally. So I think we mentioned, or if we haven't mentioned, so Polaris, the Polaris design system is built as a React UI library. And obviously, as soon as you choose any front-end library, you're setting yourself in stone of like, this is the direction we're going. We have these opinions, and we hope everybody else is along for the ride, because if you're not, then we're going to try to give you some tools like outputting just plain CSS so that you can pull in and figure it out yourselves. But beyond that, there's not much else. So we have been, because we have this third-party audience who are external to Shopify, we want to make sure that those developers have the same tools, the tools that they need. And we've been talking about maybe more tech-agnostic approaches, thinking about what would a world of Polaris design system look like if it wasn't tied to React. Some of that has been in the world of like, what if it was just HTML and CSS only, JavaScript, HTML, CSS, no libraries. We also were thinking about web components at some point, just to see like, hey, web components are in a good place now. There's a little bit of movement behind them. They're pretty interesting. So let's take a look at what that might look like. And again, the reason that we want to do those explorations is to just push on the boundaries of like, what does this design system look like, feel like, work like when it's not tied to React, especially in this growing world where we have more and more third-party developers coming to the Shopify ecosystem and really hungry to just contribute and build apps, but not wanting to be tied to React or a very specific UI library.
Yeah, that's tough. I guess you mentioned like even bundling, like needing to bundle JavaScript files in there as well if you were to move to something more framework agnostic. What kind of logic is JavaScript handling that would need to be included?
In a framework agnostic world, it would need to be any of the like dynamic interactions of the UI components. I think anything that's like a UI component that a user can click or move or anything that you do on the web would really need to rely on JavaScript to be enabled, used. Yeah.
Thinking like a collapsible component, which on click goes up and down and hides and shows the content, adding and removing like ARIA attributes as well when that happens. Like there's a lot of small things that like we benefit from JavaScript in, especially around accessibility. So
yeah, that makes sense. I was just thinking of like those areas that aren't handled like natively, where you wouldn't just be passing JavaScript into something you imported, but like there would need to be JavaScript imported as well. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, so I guess when you guys made the decision to use React, was that driven by just like what was being used internally already, and that was like the logical choice, or was it just because React is kind of so ubiquitous at this point?
It's a product decision. Yeah, like you're right. It's what are we building our product with, and where do we want to take our product to? So previously, Polaris was a Rails front-end library, and it was a whole bunch of Rails components, and a lot of our front ends were built in Rails. But as the company scaled and grew, it was a lot easier to hire React developers. It was a lot easier to grow teams around React that had deep front-end expertise. So I don't know if that's the only reason. This is some of the reasoning that I've heard of from other people, but that was a big push for like, okay, building React front ends is going to help us scale and build this product to be the best that it can be. Shopify is very growth driven though. Like we love our Rails developers to learn React. We love our React developers to learn Rails as well. So I guess what I'm trying to say there is like, we're not against any frameworks or anything like this. It's just more we're just trying to find what the right solution is for us as a company to be successful.
Yeah, totally. I think that makes a lot of sense. I guess that kind of leads me to another interesting question. So say there's like teams out there, they're kind of outgrowing this, they're like in-house rules, and they're deciding maybe they want to start building with a design system or leaning on one to like do a lot of that kind of groundwork for them, set the foundation. Would you recommend Polaris? Anyone? I mean, obviously, if you're doing like Shopify heavy integrations and stuff like that, but kind of beyond that, like say you're just a React shop, do you think like people should be looking at Polaris? Say like if you're not a React shop, do you think it's worth checking out right now?
I could try answering. I'd love to hear Yuraima's opinion as well, but like my honest opinion would be no, definitely not. Like Polaris is a opinionated design system built for like commerce admin experiences. So what I think you would notice is maybe you'd get like a really quick initial benefit. Like, wow, we've got all these components and buttons and pieces that we can build things with, and that's fine. Like, I guess if you need that, do that. But say in 6 months to a year's time, you'll be like, actually, our product needs to be more opinionated about this. So we actually believe that this is a better pattern for the problem that we're trying to solve. Like, say you were using or creating like a music player, and all you had was the Polaris resource list component. You'd probably be really frustrated about how that UI is built in an opinionated way, because that UI was built to hold a list of orders or a list of products, and now you're trying to make it a music player. Like, it's just, it wasn't constructed with that opinion. But back to what I was saying, like if you needed something to get started with really quickly or to learn from, I wouldn't be against that. But I would say that there are probably less opinionated systems or frameworks that might be a better starting place for you if that was the approach that you were taking. But maybe one day in the future, Polaris will be less opinionated or more flexible, and then I would step back on my words as well. But that's just how I feel today.
Totally. Yeah. Big plus one, Alex. I feel like the if what you're trying to do is build a really great e-commerce experience within Shopify, then Polaris is 100% what you should be reaching for. Um, Probably anything outside of that, I would be a little bit concerned because, again, Polaris is built with the idea of like, how can we provide the best e-commerce experience for our merchants within the admin? So there's nuances there. We are looking into research and making sure we understand how our merchants are using the admin, making sure that we understand how our designers and developers are building within this ecosystem. And once you break out of that, it's just really hard to know. Well, actually, it's not really hard to know. This is probably something that we can say with pretty high confidence. It's just going to fall short, or it's not going to do what you need it to do, or you're going to have to do a lot of hacky things and like really break out of the system to try and make it work for you. And even if you can manage that, you may not get the best experience out of that anyway.
Gotcha. That leads me to an interesting question, I guess. So I mean, like Shopify is obviously pretty large, but these other companies are like, you're growing, you're working on your components, and you got like pretty healthy CSS and everything. When do you think it's the right time to start thinking about like, your component library and your CSS and rules and stuff like that, and like start kind of imagining them, or at least working with them as a design system? Do you think it like happens organically and it just kind of, ends up occurring, or like is the conscious decision necessary to start like, applying design principles to your component libraries?
I'm going to say something, and I don't know if this is going to be a hot take, but I'm just going to say it, and we'll see. I feel like that is a very personal choice, and it's going to be different for every single company, and how it comes about is always going to be unique. I almost feel like it's like a vibe, it's a feeling. Obviously, you'll have people that come in and they know design systems, and they're like, yes, I want to build this design system, so I'm going to. And I'm going to try to get buy-in and make it happen and all that. But when you're sitting with the multiple products or the multiple teams, and you're like, something isn't right here. What can I do? What can I reach for? And you're like, okay, how do I start to consolidate all of these things, get more consistency? That is probably when there's a spark, and you're like, design systems, that's something that I've heard about. How can I get that started? It's one of those things that like at the last company I worked at, it was something that we knew we could really benefit from. And there were starts and stops multiple times, I think, over several years that I was there, and we just couldn't quite get there. At a different company, maybe it's something that you can get in one try. Like you have the team, the buy-in, the focus that you need to do it, and you just do it. But in other instances, it might be a longer journey to get there. It might be a longer journey to realize that you needed that tool. And hopefully once you do realize that you need it, you get the buy-in, you get everything that you need, then it's a slightly easier road to get there. I don't know if that answers the question entirely, but would love also to hear, Alex, what your thoughts are.
I mean, I would just add that it feels like it's driven from a place of frustration. So I'm a designer and I have seen 10 different buttons. I'm so frustrated by this. This is the button. Like, let everyone know that this is the button. And same thing from a developer's standpoint, which is I've built 8 different modals this year, and I don't want to do that anymore. This is how we should do modals, and trying to scale that. And what I think you find is at some point in your career as maybe like a front-end developer or a designer, you'll hit these problems or see these frustrations, and either you can band together with other people and start trying to document them, or sort of write them down. Because I think the thing when a design system starts becoming a design system isn't when you have one modal. It's when you have one modal and you give the direction and the opinion and the inspiration to others around, this is our pattern for creating modals. So I think at some point in time, you've got to be like, it's not me fixing this frustration in a silo. It's I need to educate others and inspire others to follow this approach so that we don't keep falling into the same problems. And that feels like the right sort of turning point. I don't know if I've also like butchered the question. Maybe not. Yeah.
I don't think it was a particularly concise question, so I think you guys did great. I feel like there's a lot of devs at those kind of small mid companies where they're like on that precipice. It's like, well, we've got like component libraries. Like, is this a design system? I don't know. Like, we probably need to formalize this more. But yeah, they're also feeling that frustration of there are 7 different buttons and 8 different modals that each have these, like, every permutation of these 4 attributes is leading to a different modal component. Anyway, I've been there and I know that struggle.
For me, it was like, if I have to build another carousel, I swear, I don't know, I might just leave tech altogether and get rid of this whole programming ambitions.
Okay, I feel like we've covered so much. We are coming up on time. I do want to ask, I was listening to, I believe it was Changelog.
Yeah, JS Party.
Yeah, JS Party. Okay, thank you. And Alex, you had talked about replacing Sass at Shopify. That was in 2019. And I'm looking at this amazing spreadsheet of the solution analysis. Can you just kind of talk through that just briefly? I just was wanting to ask, and I'm so curious how that process went.
Yeah, I mean, it's still ongoing. At that point in time, we were trying to think of, we had kind of like 2 branching paths. It was like, do we rebuild Polaris from scratch or do we fix Polaris as it is today? We sort of at that point was doing some research into what would it look like rebuilding Polaris from scratch and what are some of the opinions that we would want to have. And this sort of direction that we were heading in was, one of the opinions was, what do we want to do to scale our CSS? And one of the things that we felt was, at Shopify, Sass is used a lot. Like, we love Sass and we use it extensively. But our Sass functions and our Sass mixins and Sass variables, they're not documented anywhere. And at a company of our scale, where we're writing so much code all of the time, that's really bad. And that became a really big problem. And some of those things that were done in Sass were also done a long time ago, before things like CSS custom properties existed, or powerful tools like PostCSS with lots of plugins that allow us to do nesting without actually needing Sass also existed. So we kind of hit this point of like, what would a future look like without Sass? So we did some exploration into other frameworks and other approaches. One of the things that we're really excited about is also sort of like the power of the smallest CSS value. So you sort of see this in Tailwind, and we also see this in a tool called Vanilla Extract. Lots of other things are talking about this now, but those are probably 2 that people have heard about most. But the idea is, if you were to write 100,000 lines of CSS, maybe 10,000 of those lines are actually unique. So font weight 400 will get repeated, let's say, 800 times in your code, but you now only define that one time and have one class name defined for that thing. And that became a really powerful sort of motivator for a company of our scale, where we're writing so many, millions of lines of code, that if we could, in the end, sort of hit this ceiling of total CSS, because every single new thing would eventually not be a new thing. It would just be another thing that's replicated from somewhere else. That would be really powerful. So that's why we got really excited about things like Tailwind and Vanilla Extract, because they were sort of tools that took traditional CSS and changed the output to be a bit more the smallest piece possible. And that could be a really powerful solution for Shopify. We haven't really progressed in using either of those frameworks, to be honest, but where we're at now is we're back in our products, trying to make our product the best that it can be. We're not trying to create a new thing, but what we have done is we've started to remove Sass functions. So one of the things we're really excited about is we're launching version 9 of Polaris very soon. And that version is going to remove our whole public Sass API, and it's going to replace them with CSS custom properties. And those CSS custom properties are going to be documented. As full disclosure, they're going to be a complete mess. Like, this is Sass converted to CSS in the worst way possible. But the next step will be cleaning that up and making that better and making that the best API for our consumers. But we're putting it in a place where we can easily transition from one technology to the next. I don't know if we'll ever transition off Sass, but we want to be less dependent on that so that we can start to experiment with ideas like Tailwind or Vanilla Extractor playing with like reducing the total number of CSS, sort of the total bundle size of CSS, I guess is really what I'm trying to say.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for coming on. We really appreciate it, and we will see you around.
Thank you so much.
Great to meet you both.